On May 18th, 1776, as you'll remember, the Virginia Convention instructed their delegates in the Continental Congress to place a resolution that these united colonies are, and of a right, ought to be free and independent states. On June 9th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposed that resolution, and two others that went with it. One was that the colonies should work to be united, and the other that they would seek to make foreign assistance to find favorable countries that might want to support an independent United States. And when those resolutions were introduced, they had a surprising reaction. And we'll let Richard Henry Lee tell us all about that. He has a tendency to be a bit voluble and to wander off the topic, perhaps, but he'll get talking about his family and some of the recent events. But that's, he's leading up to making a very important point, and I think you'll enjoy hearing from him. So let's go with. Where is the link to Richard Henry Lee?
I am Richard Henry Lee, and I and my family were intimately involved in the events, trials, and ideologies that led up to that momentous year of 1776. The Lee family was one of the first families of Virginia, and Virginia was the most powerful English colony in the New World. It is no wonder that the Lees left a lasting mark on what became the United States of America. I and my brothers are the fourth generation of American Lees. My great-grandfather emigrated from England. Now, there's a family legend that was perpetuated into my father's day that we are actually descended from a Norman knight that came over with William the Conqueror and participated in the conquest of England. Some versions of the legend even say we're descended from William himself. Well, I'm not sure there's actually any truth to that myth. It is true, however, that the name Lee comes from the Old French Delegates, meaning of the law, so that would seem to suggest Norman influence, though more likely the name of a judge than a knight. The Lees have always been businessmen and entrepreneurs. One such ancestor was a wine merchant who sold wine to the crown. Royals are, of course, notorious for not discharging their debts. Instead of paying him in silver, the king gave him worthless land in the New World. My great-grandfather came to Virginia in 1640 to claim those 1,000 acres. That was enough property to place him on the Virginia Council of State, the governing body of the new colony. Since that time, the Lees have been a part of the ruling aristocracy. Even though the family had been transplanted to the colonies, we still maintained close ties with England, and why shouldn't we? After all, we were an English colony, and England had a voracious appetite for tobacco. Over the following generations, a whole fleet of ships took Lee tobacco to every corner of the empire. A part of thinking of ourselves as displaced Englishmen meant that the sons of prominent families in Virginia were educated in England. For our family, Eton was the school. Well, at least that's where the oldest son went. My brother Philip Ludwell went to Eton, while my brother and I attended Wakefield. By the time my education was complete, my parents had died, and my eldest brother Philip, or Colonel Phil as we called him, was the head of the household. Since I had no interest in farming or commerce, we agreed that I should go into public service. My brother secured me a position as Justice of the Peace for Westmoreland County. However, Augustine Washington, George Washington's older brother, had planned to retire from the House of Burgesses, and his seat would be open, and he suggested that I run for it. I did, and I won. My brother, Francis Lightfoot Lee, won the seat for Loudoun County. Colonel Phil was already a member. When I walked into my first session of the House of Burgesses, flanked by my two brothers, I joined 8 other cousins and in-laws. We formed the largest voting bloc in the Assembly, often controlling more than 10% of the vote. At the time of my entry into the House of Burgesses in 1758, we here in the colonies were still at war with the French. However, the capture of Fort Duquesne in September that year ended the immediate threat to Virginia, and the British victory at the Battle of Quebec the following year all but ended the conflict in North America. The problem, of course, is that it had been a very expensive war, and Parliament was looking for a way to pay for it. Since much of the conflict had taken place in the New World, they turned their eye to the American colonies. Even though they couldn't hope to cover the national debt of the empire with taxes on the colonies, they could hope to cover some of the expenses of keeping a standing army here in the colonies. What was the Parliament's solution? The Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was a bill set to replace the Molasses Act of 1733. You don't need to know all that. What you need to know is the way that Americans had gotten around the old Molasses Act was simply to smuggle molasses and sugar, which they largely turned into rum. You see, Parliament had a policy of what Edmund Burke called salutary neglect. Enforcing the law took 4 times as much money as the tax brought in, so they didn't bother. The problem with the new Sugar Act is, while it lowered the tax in an effort to make the colonists more willing to pay it, it provided more funds for enforcement of the act, therefore making it difficult to smuggle. And this at a time when the colonies were entering into a post-war economic depression, and everyone was desperately in need of a dram of rum. Americans protested this act by simply refusing to buy British luxury goods. This in turn made British merchants lose money, and so they petitioned Parliament for the repeal of the Sugar Act. Next, Parliament tried a different tactic when they passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was an act requiring that a government tax stamp be affixed to various different paper products. So a newspaper, a deck of playing cards, marriage license, legal document, these all would require that a tax be paid so that a stamp might be affixed to the product before it was sold. On the surface, there may seem to be very little difference between these 2 acts, but in fact, they were radically different. The Sugar Act was a tariff. It was an act designed to regulate commerce and trade, perfectly legal for Parliament to pass. The Stamp Act, on the other hand, was a direct tax on domestically produced and consumed items. Now, it's understandable that Parliament might say you need to pay a duty on that imported barrel of molasses, but it is another thing entirely for them to say you have to pay a tax in order to sell a newspaper that you printed on your own press with your own paper in your home colony. It is the birthright privilege of every British subject that he cannot be taxed but by the consent of a Parliament in which he is represented by persons chosen by the people and who themselves pay a part of the tax they impose upon others. I wrote a set of resolutions related to the Stamp Act and presented them to the gentlemen of Westmoreland County. 3 of my brothers and 4 Washingtons signed on February 27, 1766. A decade before the Declaration of Independence, Westmoreland County declared that Parliament had no right to extend such a jurisdiction over it. Because of the public protests and pressure from British merchants, the Stamp Act was repealed almost as quickly as it went into effect. In the years that followed, however, Parliament continued to try to apply direct revenue duties to the colonies. In May of 1769, George Mason proposed a resolution in the House of Burgesses that only the governor and the authorized legislature were authorized to tax the colonists of Virginia. The royal governor responded by dissolving the House of Burgesses. Protests continued, and the following year, on March 5th, they erupted into violence as British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of protesting citizens, killing 5 in what would become known forever as the Boston Massacre. Even then, Parliament would not fully relent. They removed all the duties but one, the tea tax. This led to protests all along the North Atlantic seaboard, but the most famous one happened on December 16, 1773, in Boston. The Boston Tea Party. 342 chests of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor. That's enough tea to make 18.5 million cups. The British responded by closing the port of Boston and passing what became known to the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These acts allowed for British officials and American offenders both to be tried in England for crimes committed here. They also updated the Quartering Act, allowing redcoat soldiers to occupy unused buildings. Other colonies started sending food and supplies by wagon to the people of Boston and continued to boycott British goods. One of the problems we faced was the fact that groups in each colony were acting independently from one another. Although many like-minded individuals from all across the colonies had been writing letters for a decade through committees of correspondence, it was sometimes faster to communicate between Williamsburg and London than between Williamsburg and Boston. So in a letter to Samuel Adams in June of '74, I proposed a Continental Congress. That September, 55 delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for 7 weeks. We agreed to a ban on British goods and resolved to draft a petition to the King asking for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts and the removal of troops from Boston City. Indeed, we declared all acts passed by Parliament since 1763 to be in violation of the rights of British citizens of America. I suggested that the American colonies arm themselves to prepare for possible military conflict. This the moderates were not compelled to agree with. The drafting of the petition to His Majesty fell to John Adams and myself. I have heard that when the King saw it, he sneered, complimented its eloquence, and then laid it aside. A fortnight later, he rejected it and ordered Parliament to halt trade, arrest protesters, and protect loyalists. Parliament, knowing that some reconciliation might still be possible, instead issued a pardon for repentant rebels. But not for myself, Patrick Henry, George Washington, John Hancock, or the Adamses. Indeed, we would be captured if possible, hanged, and then drawn and quartered. The most important thing that was decided by the First Continental Congress, however, is that there would be a Second Continental Congress the following May. Just before we drew together to meet, war broke out. On April 19, 1775, the shot heard around the world rang out on Lexington Green in Massachusetts. Suddenly, my suggestion of a few months earlier that the colonies arm themselves and prepare for war seemed like a sensible precaution. In the following months, the representatives from the 13 colonies began to think and act more like a nation. The New England militias were adopted into a new Continental Army. The colonies began to send troops to the site, and George Washington was named Commander-in-Chief. In the meantime, each of the colonies had to decide how to react to the growing conflict. Many colonies held conventions to draft new frames of government and to propose resolutions to safeguard the life, liberty, and property of their citizens. The Revolutionary Virginia Convention was held in May of 1776, and they passed a resolution instructing Virginia's delegates, such as myself, in the Continental Congress to propose to that respectable body to declare the United Colonies free and independent. I then returned to Congress, and on June 7th I proposed the following resolution. Resolved that these United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. As I finished uttering those words, the most important words I had ever uttered in front of the most important men in America, was there cheering? Were there rounds of huzzah? No. My resolution was met with deafening silence. Everyone was afraid to speak. The thing that we had discussed and whispered about for so long was suddenly out in the light of day, but who would claim it? Even the Massachusetts delegation refused to commit. Oh, John and Samuel Adams were strongly behind me, but other members of their delegation came from small towns and didn't think the time was right for declaring separation. 5 colonies stood in favor of independence and 5 colonies against, with the other 3 undecided. I decided it would be best to postpone the vote and debate until July 2nd. And in the meantime, I went to work trying to convince those worthy gentlemen to follow the path that they knew was the right one. One unexpected ally I had in this was my sister Alice. She had married a prominent Philadelphia physician, Dr. William Shippen, and her lavishly stocked table and wine cellar went a long way to convincing many delegates. The question was not whether by declaration of independence we should make ourselves what we were not, but whether we should declare a fact that already existed. When Congress finally voted, 12 states voted for American independence, with only New York abstaining. Immediately after the vote, I returned to Virginia. Let people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams finish the work. The Lees of Virginia had made their mark.
But at that point in June 1776, both Virginia and Rhode Island had declared their independence in May. Rhode Island had done so and said that they were now totally independent of Britain. And then there's a question about North Carolina. North Carolina claims that it was also a free and independent state before the Declaration of Independence. But that depends on something called the Mecklenburg Resolves, which actually were made in 1775. So it would have been the first independent state in the United States more than a year before the Declaration of Independence. But the Mecklenburg Resolves, Mecklenburg is the county that Charlotte is in. So it was in a strongly Scotch-Irish settlement, and they pulled up bunches. But the question of this is, these were simply one county's resolve. So instead of really saying that North Carolina was independent before the Declaration, we could say that the good people of Charlotte were independent before the Declaration. So now let's continue with this. Yes. The New England states in general were strongly in favor of independence all along. They had considerably fewer ties to Britain. The New England churches were all Congregationalists. Naturally enough, there were other people who were Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians, Catholics and Jews scattered around in New England. But the churches that were supported, that were the established churches maintained by taxes, were all Congregationalists, the heirs of the Puritans, so they had nothing to do with any denomination of Britain. And in many ways, Massachusetts Bay, which then included Maine and New Hampshire and Connecticut, had all considered themselves quasi-independent from the 17th century on. So that you had a scattering, rather, of people who opposed independence. And for example, the Anglican clergy, who in New England were almost all Yale graduates who had converted, or Harvard graduates, who had converted to the Church of England for whatever reason that led them to do that. And so it was little small groups like that, rather than anything that would swing the colonies together. New York is a different case. New York had a very, very strong loyalist community, people who were very favorable to stay part of Britain. And this is because of the structure of society there. Paul Parker and I both hail from Long Island. So let me start with Long Island, 109-mile stretch into the Atlantic Ocean from New York City. So the eastern end of Long Island, maybe 60% of the island, which is essentially Suffolk County, was settled from Connecticut. These people had everything in common with the people in Connecticut and very little in common with the people, say, in the Hudson Valley. And consequently, Suffolk County was as staunchly for independence as any county anywhere in New England. The western end of Long Island is a different mix of population. It included substantial numbers of people of Dutch descent, and the Dutch in general were not all that enthusiastic about breaking with Britain. And although there were some obviously some significant Dutch ancestry patriots, and there was also a very large Quaker population, and Friends wanted to be at best neutral. They had a peace testimony. And many of them leaned toward the loyalist side anyway. So this is kind of a microcosm of New York, because the western end of Long Island had such a strong loyalist population that the Continental Congress had to send Colonel Hurd and some soldiers in there to disarm them in the early part of 1776, January, February 1776. And as soon as the British arrived, the Queens County militia and Kings County militia immediately formed to support the British Army. So there were lots of loyalists at that end of Long Island. The Hudson Valley is a little mixed because basically it was controlled by a number of families who were very large landowners. And some of them, Schuyler's and others, who were staunchly for the United Colonies, others like the Delancey's, Cortland's, were committed almost from day one to the British side. And again, you had, especially in the southern part of the Hudson Valley, you had a lot of Quakers who were pacifists and didn't really want to line up with anyone. So New York is itself divided, and yet, we'll go back to New York. New York is divided. So when Robert R. Livingston, who was what he's called the Chancellor, I think, he was like the Supreme Justice in the courts in New York State. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he was not altogether opposed to having a declaration of independence. He was not a loyalist, but he thought the timing was wrong. That we should wait, looking at those other two resolutions that came with Richard Henry Lee, that we should have made friends with the French or whoever, and we should have been really a United States rather than still independent colonies. So New York did not support the resolution immediately. They were one of the ones who voted against it. And even when in July the final vote was taken, New York abstained, but they abstained because they had not been instructed by the state. By then there was a New York State legislature. The delegates in Congress had not been instructed to vote for or against, so they said we can't vote. But then right after the Declaration was adopted, New York hastily separated instructions he has to vote for it. And Robert R. Livingston ended up signing for issue independence. So it's Northern but excellent. Pennsylvania, for some of the same reasons, dragged its feet. We had in Pennsylvania, again, what is Pennsylvania is the Quaker colony. We had a very strong peace group in Pennsylvania, composed not only of Quakers, but of German Mennonites and Moravians and the Church of the Brethren. So there were both English and German pacifists in considerable numbers, and traditionally they had been allied and kept the Quakers in power until about the beginning of the French and Indian War, when the Quakers withdrew because they couldn't vote for money to buy weapons. So the strongest voice in the Pennsylvania delegate was John Dickinson. We met him before. John Dickinson was a man of Quaker parentage and married to a Quaker, and yet was not actually a member of any meeting. So we can't quite call him a Quaker, but he came from this very strong peace position, and he had all through right to the very last. He actually voted on the last debate. He voted against independence and went back to Delaware, where he had a large estate, and he was one of the wealthier people of the colonies, and continued there to support the United States. And all right, so Pennsylvania opposed, and then finally, at the last, except for John Dickinson, went for independence. And just let's look at the next one. This is reminding you of John Dickinson's famous letters from forward Pennsylvania, which made the very strong argument that was made actually a few minutes ago by Richard Henry Lee, that Parliament, yes, they could deal with trade and commerce. That was legitimate, but you have no authority whatsoever to pass any direct tax on the people in the colonies, because we don't have to battle it back. Right. Let's go to the next one. Now, Maryland is a different story. Maryland's delegation in the Continental Congress, Maryland's convention is very much like Virginia. The people who were represented were all really quite wealthy, big landowners, planters, or merchants from Annapolis or Baltimore, and it was not really a voice of the people, the ordinary people, in very much in Maryland, either before or after it for a long time. But the gathering storm in Maryland was that the people like Samuel Chase, Charles Carrollton, who were pushing for independence, were gaining the upper hand. And just before they, actually in the month of May 1776, the royal governor of Maryland, it wasn't the royal governor, proprietor governor of Maryland, we come back to that, Sir Robert Eden, withdrew. He left the colony, and with him some of his administrative people, and they took a ship to go back to England. So Maryland was without the governor and ready to sail with. One of the reasons why there was opposition in Maryland, it was less, so to speak, ethnic or religious. It came from the fact that Maryland was a proprietary colony, even as Pennsylvania was. And Pennsylvania had also fought the Penn thing. And in Maryland, the legislature was often at loggerheads with Lord Baltimore. So they had an immediate enemy. And in Pennsylvania, there was a campaign in the late 1760s led by Ben Franklin to drop the proprietary and guess what? Make Pennsylvania a royal colony. And Franklin was the spearhead for that, and it was supported very much by the Presbyterians, who were both English, primarily Scotch-Irish, and who ultimately would be the backbone of the Independence Party in Pennsylvania. So this was just wide open for Maryland. But there were again a substantial number of people who remained loyal to Britain in Maryland. And some of them were in the merchant class from Annapolis and Baltimore, because they were dependent now on a grain trade, which was being taken largely by British and Irish markets. But let's go on. Who is left? All right, the last one is South Carolina. North Carolina, pretty positive. Georgia, for fairly obvious reasons, because it was so much a frontier colony, it had to go with the rest of the colonies, and they were very supportive. South Carolina, again, a very mixed kind of opposition. That there was a very substantial loyalist body in South Carolina, and the call for independence was probably most concentrated not in Charleston and in well-to-do merchants, but in the back country of upper South Carolina, which was largely Scotch-Irish and Presbyterian. But nevertheless, Edward Rutledge, one of three Rutledges who were in the Continental Congress, a very wealthy family from Charleston with land interests. He opposed, and he was the head of the delegation, so he opposed in the name of South Carolina any action. And again, just trying to sum up, while there was honestly a good deal of reality behind the argument that was made by Joseph Galloway, who was from Pennsylvania, that in the colonies, about a third of the people were for independence. About a third of them were anxious to remain linked with Britain. And the other third, frankly, my dear, didn't give a damn. And so, what regret about a picture, I couldn't find an earlier picture, Edward Rutledge was the youngest man of the Continental Congress. He was only in his early 20s. That gentleman, which looked older. Well, anyway, I've rambled on long enough, I think. And shall we go to questions, comments? Shall we?
Sorry.
I will blink like a mole.
We got a second speaker.
Given what you've been saying, where there was a mix of opposition, and it seems to be then striking that we ever managed to get the Declaration of Independence passed. How did that work out?
Well, that's going to be the next word around, I think. But the point was that again, as a senior voter, again, how did we actually get the declaration after all? How did it get passed? And it was a number of the delegates who were initially opposed were opposed for reasons like we really should first line up some foreign aid and not, oh no, we should never be independent, or that, wait a minute, we are barely talking to one another outside of the Congress. Shouldn't we wait until the people in New York are enthusiastically for independence? And the argument against both of those that was made at the time in those last debates in the 2nd of July was that, that might take forever. And the way to get foreign aid, the way to get colonies united is to say, hey, we are the United States.
Was the Boston Massacre a critical turning point in that?
I don't know. The Richard Henry Lee said something about that. I don't know. I really don't know. In New England, of course it was, but the point was in the Boston Massacre in 1770 that it started with some kids throwing snowballs in one section, and then it accelerated, and there was a crowd, and people started throwing rocks, and the sentry called for help, and the officer of the guard brought some soldiers from the barracks, and they lined up and then somebody said, fire, damn you, fire. Was that somebody in the crowd? Was that the officer commanding? And who was hired? He was on their sergeant. And at any rate, John Adams defended the British soldiers who were charged with murder of that case, and won. And that was because, among other things, it was dubious who had they actually been ordered to die. Now, the fact that they were being held with rocks, they have a gun in your head during quietly while they defend yourself. So Adams did that. And also on the ground that the people who were killed were not substantial Australians. They were kind of people from the who would come off ships, so sailors and so on, and even a black man, a local Christmas family. And so, you know, but in this particular case, a picture was worth a million words. The Paul Revere's engraving of these brutal British soldiers shooting down a whole lot of innocent looking Americans, that made a lot more sense than anything John Adams could say or anybody could write, because that's how it was. You know, it was a brutal massacre that it became the most. I'm sure that's a lot to do with the way various people thought.
Other questions?
Yes, so.
You mentioned a number of times that the people that were in opposition were wealthy. Was it a class kind of determination, or was it more broadly representative?
There were probably I tried to think who was in Massachusetts and actually all of the New England delegates in Congress, as I named this a couple there, were all basically pretty well off professionals or merchants. You had, well, let me just use one illustration. This is post-revolution. The Constitution of Maryland provided that all property owners could vote. You had to be a property owner. And if you were to stand for the legislature, you had to be worth at least so much money. And if you were to stand for the upper house, you had to be worth more money. If you were to run for governor, you had to have property larger than that. So it was almost as though in their minds, we wanted to have the leaders would be people who had inherited a nice set of plantations, or who had made a lot of money by careful trade. That these were not just were lawyers, judges, that these people were not just intelligent professionals, but they also had demonstrated that they had a stake in the colony, in the outcome of whatever it was, including independence. That, you know, you had all these leads in the House of Burgesses because not only were they influential by nature of who they were, but you couldn't just buy them, you couldn't dismiss them, and if everything went wrong, they were going to suffer very greatly because they had all that economic pie. So it was government by the well-to-do, basically, anyway, however one sliced it.
Anybody else?
Getting long-winded. I'm getting long-winded because I'm old and tired. So, well, next week we're taking this to the next stage and how it finally plays out.
No questions.
No more questions. So, as without even having to pack up your books, you were released. You never have to wait for the bell. It's great having you all here. Thank you.